The auctioneer stopped his own chant to laugh, and 400 people in a mowed hayfield laughed with him, and that is how Ray Hollis came to own 9 tons of rusted steel for $45. It was the second Saturday of October 1978 outside Pike Hollow, Indiana, at a farm sale that had already run 5 hours long. Wendell Pike had sold a corn planter, 2 hay wagons, a milk cooler, and a box of pipe wrenches without breaking rhythm. Then the crew wheeled up Lot 61 on a low timber skid behind a tractor, and the rhythm broke. The thing standing on that skid was a round cage of steel, 9 feet across and taller than any man in the field. Flat vertical bars as wide as a hand ran floor to ceiling around it. Heavy strap iron banded it top and bottom, riveted at every crossing with rivet heads the size of walnuts. All of it had gone the color of a horseshoe left 20 years in the rain. An orange so deep it looked warm in the sun. "Folks," Wendell said into the microphone, "the card says steel cage." Somebody in the front hollered that it was a bullpen. Somebody else said it was a corn crib for a farmer who did not trust his neighbors. A man with a braying laugh said it was the biggest bird cage in Indiana. Wendell let them have it, because a good auctioneer knows a crowd that is laughing is a crowd that is awake, and he tried $100 and got nothing. He tried 50. He tried 25. The field went quiet in the particular way a field goes quiet when 400 people have all done the same arithmetic at the same time. Lyle Trask did the arithmetic out loud. He bought scrap for the river towns, and he was standing on a hay bale with his thumbs in his belt. 9 tons, he said, at the price steel was fetching that autumn, was worth something on paper. But you would need a crane to lift it, a lowboy to haul it, and a torchman for 2 days to cut it into pieces a mill would take, and the barn wall would have to come out to get it into daylight at all. By the time you were done, you had paid for the privilege of owning it. "That ain't scrap," Lyle said. "That's a hole in the ground shaped like a cage." That was when Ray Hollis put his hand up. He was 54 years old, a machinery mechanic out of the north end of Kessel County, and he was wearing the blue denim bib overalls and the pale straw hat he wore to everything including church. He had walked out of the crowd while Wendell was working the price down, and he was standing with one flat palm resting on the cage's frame, the way another man might rest a hand on a horse. He did not wave. He just lifted 2 fingers. $45, Wendell said, astonished. "I have 45. Do I hear 50? Do I hear anything at all?" He waited. He looked at Lyle. Lyle laughed and shook his head and made a small pushing motion with both hands, the way you decline a second helping. "Sold," Wendell said, "for $45 to the man who is going to regret it." The field enjoyed that more than anything else that had happened all day. A man near the wagons called out to ask whether Ray was buying it for June, and the laugh went around again. Ray took the ticket, folded it, put it in the bib pocket of his overalls, and kept his hand on the iron a moment longer than he needed to. Here is what nobody else in that hayfield had done. At 7 that morning, before the coffee wagon opened, Ray had walked the whole line of lots the way he always did, and he had walked around Lot 61 twice, slowly, and he had counted. The inside of the cage was divided into 8 wedge-shaped stalls by steel plate walls, like a pie cut into 8 pieces, all of them joined to a heavy round column at the center. 8 stalls. And in the outer wall of the cage, all the way around, one door. One narrow barred opening and no other. Ray was a man who fixed corn pickers and manure spreaders for a living, and his whole trade was the belief that a machine cannot lie about what it is for. 8 rooms and 1 door is not a building. 8 rooms and 1 door is arithmetic that does not close. Either the man who built it was a fool, or the outer wall stood still and the inside was meant to move. And Ray had never once in his life met a fool who could afford rivets like that. If you've made it this far into Ray Hollis's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Getting it home cost him 14 times what he paid for it. The cage had spent 19 years inside a bank barn on the Vosburg place, standing in the center bay with hay bales stacked against it, and Lyle had been right that the barn had to give something up. Ray took the sliding door and 2 wall posts out, hired a crane from the elevator, and rented a lowboy trailer with a driver who charged by the hour and made sure Ray knew it. The invoice for moving $45 worth of iron came to $630. He told June the number at the kitchen table, and she wrote it in the book without comment, which he understood to be a kindness, and then she asked what he thought it was. "I think it turns," he said. The county thought it was the funniest thing that had happened since the drive-in burned. At the elevator, men asked him what he was keeping in the cage. At the diner, somebody left a chicken feather on the hood of his truck. Wendell Pike, who was fond of him, sent a note saying that if Ray ever wanted to buy the other one, he had a whole barn full. Ray let it run. He set the cage on cribbing beside his shop where the yard light hit it. And for 3 weeks, he did nothing but walk out after supper and look at it, which is a thing mechanics do that nobody else understands. He started cutting rust off it the 2nd week of November with a wire wheel on a grinder and a 5-gallon bucket of kerosene, working from the bottom, because the bottom is where the truth of a machine usually lives. The base of the cage was a ring of steel a foot deep, and under 19 years of barn dust and chaff and rust, the wheel found something Ray had to shut the grinder off to look at. Teeth, not rough teeth, not the crude cast teeth of a hay loader sprocket. The whole outer face of that base ring had been cut into gear teeth, evenly all the way around, with a little curved flank that says, "A man put the ring in a machine and cut it there on purpose." Ray followed it around the entire 9-foot circle with the grinder, and then went and got a lantern because the daylight had quit, and he sat on an upturned bucket in the cold and counted them one at a time until he had gone all the way back to the piece of chalk he had started from. A ring of teeth is not a decoration. A ring of teeth is half of a conversation, and something else in the world had been built to say the other half. He found the other half the following night. Behind a plate at the bottom of the cage's frame, packed solid with grease that had gone to varnish and had to be chipped, was a bronze worm the size of a rolling pin, sitting in the ring's teeth exactly the way a worm sits in a wheel, with a square shaft coming off it and 2 cast-bearing caps. And under that, when he chipped further, a circular track of hardened steel with 32 cast rollers riding in it, laid in a channel of grease that had turned into something like brown soap. The inner drum of the cage, all 8 wedge stalls and the center column, was not sitting on the ground at all. It was floating on rollers. The maker's plate was on the outside of the shell under 3 coats of gray barn paint, and it took him an hour with a scraper and a rag because he would not put a wheel to it. When it came up, it was cast iron, oval, the letters raised, Vanderveer Jail Works, Indianapolis, IND, and below that, Pat, 1881. And below that, in smaller figures, 1911, Ray sat down on the skid and put his hat on his knee. Dot Reisner ran the Kessel County Historical Society out of 2 rooms over the old feed store, and she was a woman who did not like to be excited in front of people. Ray came in on a Tuesday in December with a rubbing of the plate on a piece of butcher paper, and she took it to the window, and she was quiet for long enough that he began to feel foolish. Then she went to a shallow drawer and brought out a photograph, 11 by 14, mounted on grayboard. The old Kessel County Jail Annex, 3rd floor, 1912, a round steel cage in the middle of a bare room. Banded with strap iron, riveted, with a jailer standing beside it in a vest and shirt sleeves with his hand on a crank. "Count the doors," Dot said. There was one. What Ray Hollis had bought for $45 was a revolving cell block. They were patented in 1881 by 2 men in Indianapolis who had worked out an unsettling and rather brilliant idea: build the cells as a solid drum of wedge-shaped rooms. Set that drum on a roller race inside a fixed outer shell of bars and cut exactly 1 doorway in the shell. Then the jailer turns a crank. The gearing is enormous, hundreds of turns down to 1, so one man's arm moves the whole drum, and each cell in its turn comes around to the single opening. Nobody inside can reach a lock, because there are no locks to reach, there is only alignment. A single doorway and 1 crank and no keys at all will hold 8 men. And the man turning the crank never has to open anything. A few hundred of them were built for county jails across the middle of the country. Almost all were torn out, because they had a habit that will be obvious to anybody who has ever worked around moving machinery. Dot said the standard figure she had read was that fewer than 20 survived anywhere, and of the single-tier ones, a handful. And the Kessel County Annex, she said, was pulled down in 1959, and the county's own minutes said the fixtures went out for scrap that spring. She had asked about the cell block twice in her life, and been told twice that it had been cut up and sold by the pound. Somebody in 1959 had let a 9-ton revolving jail walk out the back gate on a timber skid, and had let a farmer put hay bales against it for 19 years. Ray went home and spent the last week of December cleaning the race, and then he cut a length of square stock, filed a socket onto it, dropped it over the worm shaft, and pulled. Nothing. He pulled harder, and then he put a 4-foot pipe on it and leaned his whole 200 pounds into it. And the only thing that moved was the pipe bending. He wrote off the day, greased everything again, warmed the drum with a salamander heater for 11 hours, tried again. Nothing. A machine that has stood 19 years in a barn is allowed to be stubborn, but a roller race that is packed and freed and warm and greased is not allowed to be a wall. He found it on the 3rd of January, lying on a piece of cardboard under the base ring with a drop light, and when he found it, he did not say anything for a while. A steel drift key, hardened, about the size of a chisel, had been driven down into the gear teeth from above and burred over so it could not back out. 6 inches away, the original crankshaft had been cut clean through with a hacksaw, and the cut was square and patient and finished, not the rough hack of a thief in a hurry. The bronze drive nut had been backed off 2 full turns and pinned with a rivet so it could never be tightened. And when Ray walked around to the doorway and looked with the light, he saw that 1 cell door in the inner drum had been welded to its frame, permanently open, with a bead laid in by somebody who knew how to lay a bead. That machine had not died. Somebody had gone at it with a hacksaw, a drift, a drill, and a welder, and had taken his time and had made sure that no one after him could ever turn it again. Reasoner found the name in about 10 minutes, because the county had kept its personnel rolls even when it had not kept its jail. The turnkey at the Kessel County Annex from 1946 until it closed was a man named Ellis Nunn. And Ellis Nunn was 74 years old and living on a half-acre at the edge of New Cambridge with a garden that people talked about. He answered the door in a cardigan, and he knew why Ray was there before Ray finished the second sentence. He did not invite him in. He stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame, and he said, "You bought the drum." Then he told it, standing up, in about 90 seconds, the way men tell the thing they have told themselves 10,000 times. In March of 1949, he was on the crank on a Sunday morning, bringing cell 4 around to the door for breakfast. A man named Perry, in for a bad check and due out on Tuesday, had his arm through the bars of his own cell, reaching for a cigarette somebody had dropped on the floor outside. Ellis could not see cell 4 from the crank position. That was the design. Nobody could. The drum came around, and the fixed shell came past like a pair of shears, and Perry lost the arm below the elbow. He lived, Ellis said. He lived a long time. He sold insurance in Fort Wayne, and he was decent to me every time I ever saw him, which was worse. The county put a sign up and told the jailers to shout a warning before turning, and Ellis worked that crank for 4 more months and then went down to the basement one night with a hacksaw and killed it, and told the sheriff the following morning what he had done, and the sheriff wrote it down as broken and ordered 2 flat doors cut into the shell and never said another word about it. "I have not been sorry once," Ellis said. "You want to make it turn again? Don't. Leave it stand." Ray drove home the long way and did not eat supper. For 8 days he was as close as he ever came to calling Lyle Trask. He would go out at night and stand in front of the drum with the yard light behind him and think about a man reaching for a cigarette. June let him have all 8 days, and on the 9th she came out to the shop in her coat with 2 cups of coffee and stood with him and looked at the thing, and she said, "Ray, he didn't cut it because it turned. He cut it because it couldn't see." He went to work the next morning at 5:30. It took him until the middle of March. He drilled the drift key out in 9 passes rather than hammer it and risk the teeth. He turned a new crankshaft on the lathe at the implement dealer's after hours with a proper key seat and made a bronze bushing for it. He pulled the pinned nut, made a new one, set the backlash with feeler gauges. He cleaned every one of the 32 rollers by hand in a coffee can of solvent and laid them back in the race in fresh grease. And then he built the thing Ellis Nunn had not been given in 1949. He fabricated a hinged steel guard, a shallow curved fence that stood off the shell at each stall so that nothing could pass from the inside of the drum out through the shell in the plane where the shear happened. He linked all 8 guards to a single ring rod, and he made the rod part of the drive unless every guard is down and latched. A dog drops into the gear ring and the crank will not move a 1/4 inch. He drew it on the back of a feed calendar first, and he took the drawing to Ellis Nunn's house and left it in the storm door, because Ellis had not answered the second time either. On the 9th of April, at about 10 at night, alone, Ray Hollis latched 8 guards, put both hands on a crank he had made himself, and turned it. There was no scream of metal. There was no groan. There was a soft, granular sound like a heavy drawer, and 9 tons of riveted steel began to rotate on 32 rollers in a fresh bed of grease silently, and cell 1 came around and stood in the doorway of the shell like a room arriving. He turned it all the way around, all 8. And then he sat down on the skid in the dark with the crank in his hand and his heart going like a young man's. The Kessel County Fair opens the last week of July, and the machinery hall on the north side of the grounds is where the county puts its steam engines and its hit-and-miss motors and its restored corn shellers. Ray asked for a spot in the middle of the floor. It took a lowboy, the elevator's crane, 6 men, and 4 hours to walk that drum in on rollers, and when the hall opened on Tuesday morning, there was a 9-foot rusted cage sitting where the tractors usually go, with a hand-lettered card on an easel beside it that read Kessel County Jail Annex, 1911, 8 cells, 9 tons, turned by hand. By 11 o'clock, the hall was full because word had gone around the fairgrounds the way it does. Wendell Pike came in from the sale barn in his mustard-tan jacket. Lyle Trask came in with a paper cup of coffee and stood at the back with his arms crossed. Dot Reasoner set her photograph on an easel beside the drum and told about 150 people in her flat, careful voice what a revolving cell block was, and finished by telling them to count the doors in the picture and then to count the doors on the machine in front of them. Ray did not make a speech. He was not able to. He put one flat hand on the shell the way he had at the auction, and then he latched the 8 guards one at a time, and every latch made a small, hard sound that carried. And the hall got quieter with each one. Then he took the crank and turned it. 9 tons moved without a sound. You could hear a woman say, "Oh." You could hear the drum's soft, granular travel and the fairground announcer somewhere far outside calling a class of Holsteins, and nothing else at all. Cell after cell came around and stood in the shell's one doorway and went on past, 8 rooms parading through a single door, and the hall of a county fair that had come to look at a rusty cage stood there with its mouth open and did not make a sound. Wendell Pike said afterward that in 31 years on the tailgate he had never once had a room go that quiet, and that he had made it go quiet in the other direction 10 months earlier and had been proud of himself for it. Lyle Trask, who had priced it by the pound, said it out loud to the man next to him, not as a joke. Scrap's just iron nobody asked a question about. Ellis Nunn came in at 12:20. He was wearing a tie, because he wore a tie to the fair. He stood at the edge of the crowd through 2 full revolutions with his hat in his hand and his face doing nothing at all. Then he came forward and people moved out of his way without knowing why, and he crouched down at the base ring, 74 years old, and looked at the 8 hinged guards and the ring rod and the dog that drops into the teeth. He got up slowly. He put one flat hand on the bars, the whole palm the way Ray had. "Show me it stops," he said. Ray unlatched one guard, a single one out of 8. The rod slacked, the dog dropped, and the crank went solid. Ellis Nunn stood looking at that for a long moment. Then he latched it back down himself and put his hands on the crank and turned the drum a full circle with the whole machinery hall watching a retired jailer bring 8 empty cells past one door, and when it came back around to where it started, he let go and said, "That's how it should have been built." The drum is still in Kessel County. Ray Hollis turned down $30,000 from a man in Ohio who collected what he called institutional ironwork, and gave the cell block to the Historical Society for $1 on the written condition that the guards stay on it and that it be turned by hand by a person in front of people and never motorized. It stands today in the ground floor of the old courthouse annex that survived the wrecking in 1959, and on the second Saturday of every month, somebody turns it. Dot Reasoner's card beside it gives the date, the works, the patent, and the weight. Ellis Nunn's name is on it too. He asked that it be, and he asked that the sentence about March of 1949 be on it as well, in plain words, and it is. And the visitors do what Ray Hollis did in a mowed hayfield at 7 in the morning with a folded sale bill in his hand. They walk all the way around it, once slowly, the way you circle something you cannot yet name. They look at the 8 wedge-shaped rooms and the heavy column at the middle holding them together. Then they go looking for the second door, and there isn't one, and that is the moment the whole thing opens up in front of them. The same crack of arithmetic that a farm mechanic put $45 into because he could not make it close.